Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today we continue our chronological look at recordings that Carl Wilson participated in outside the Beach Boys. And we are up to the landmark year of 1974. Landmark not only because it was the year of the Beach Boys' unexpected big success with the Endless Summer collection, but it was also the year of two of the most high-profile records that Carl ever participated in outside the group. And let's talk first about a figure who, either directly or indirectly, was certainly influential in Carl participating in those recordings. James William Guercio began touring with the Beach Boys, standing in on bass, early in 1974 after the departure of Blondie Chaplin. And for a time, he also became the Beach Boys' manager. You can see Guercio here performing with Carl in 1975. By 1974, Guercio already had a long history in the music business, beginning with session work in the mid-60s. He moved into production as well, producing the smash hit Blood, Sweat, and Tears album, which went to #1 for 7 weeks in 1969. In 1970, it won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Of course, he became best known for his work with Chicago. Guercio opened a luxurious, state-of-the-art recording facility, Caribou Ranch Studios, on some property he owned near Nederland, Colorado. It opened in 1972. In 1971, they had tested the facility by recording some of Joe Walsh's Barnstorm album there, with the studio reportedly inspiring the album's title. After that came Rick Derringer's All-American Boy, parts of Countdown to Ecstasy by Steely Dan, some of the Manassas Down the Road album, Chicago 6, and many others. By 1974, it was one of the hottest studios in the world. Over the next decade or so, an incredible array of rock and roll talent would record albums there. Also in 1974, the Beach Boys held sessions at Caribou for a new album. Among the items recorded reportedly were early versions of Good Timin', California Feelin', and Ding Dang. By all reports, the results were pretty meager and the sessions were shelved. Of course, beginning with the Light album, which was co-produced by Guercio, the Beach Boys were on the Caribou Records label, which also released Dennis and Carl's solo albums. Caribou Ranch seems to have particularly appealed to Carl. He eventually moved to Colorado and recorded his first and parts of his second solo albums there. His 1981 album even uses the Caribou Ranch font. That font was also used on the Beach Boys' 10 Years of Harmony collection, released on Caribou later in 1981. The Guercio-Caribou connection will obviously figure in some of Carl's guest appearances, beginning with Wishin' You Were Here from Chicago 7, released March 8, 1974. The song, written by Peter Cetera, had reportedly been a late addition to the album, recorded at Caribou toward the end of 1973. Carl, along with Dennis and Alan, were recruited by Cetera to sing on the track and added their vocals at a session on November 13th. From what I've read, the three of them were at Caribou to add vocals to some unfinished Beach Boy tracks. Does anybody happen to know what they were working on at Caribou late in 1973? In any case, Wishing You Were Here is a great record. Terry Kath's lead vocal is understated and carries a lot of gravitas, really anchoring the performance. Cetera's vocals on the And I'd Like to Change My Life section are almost the complete opposite, high and almost a bit manic. The beautiful ethereal backing from Carl, Dennis, and Alan bind it all together and make it a fantastic record. Wishing You Were Here was released as a single A-side on October 8, 1974. It peaked at number 11 on November 30th for 2 weeks. This could have, and maybe should have, provided a template for a kind of mature, modern sound the Beach Boys could have pursued in the mid to late 70s. I suppose maybe in some ways, Good Timin', Baby Blue, Full Sail, and some of Dennis and Carl's other work arguably might owe something to its sound. It's a direction I wish they'd pursued further. Anyway, Wishing You Were Here is a great record with beautiful vocal performances from Carl, Dennis, Alan, Terry Kath, and Peter Cetera. Of course, Chicago and the Beach Boys will have a chance to perform it together live on the now legendary co-headlining Beachago tour in 1975. Of the Carl Wilson guest appearances we'll be discussing here, This one was the most commercially successful, apart from one other with Chicago, which we'll discuss later, and the next one. Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me from Elton John's Caribou album. The album, which the title makes clear was recorded at Caribou Studios, was released on June 24th, 1974. The track Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me, which was also the lead-off single, features backing vocals by Carl Wilson, Bruce Johnston, Tony Tennille, and Billy Hinchy. Vocal arrangements are credited as by Bruce Johnston with help from the Captain. Players on the track are Elton John and the four members of his band, Dee Murray, Nigel Olsson, Davy Johnstone, and Ray Cooper, plus David Henschel on mellotron and a horn arrangement by Del Newman. It was a song that Elton John initially didn't rate very highly. In his 2019 memoir, Me, he recalls, during the initial recording, he announced he hated it and was stopping the session, saying they should send the song to Engelbert Humperdinck. He was eventually persuaded to finish it, but by that time hated it even more and threatened to kill producer Gus Dudgeon with his bare hands if it ended up on the album. Obviously, his stance on the song soon mellowed. Elton John's band members Davy, Dee, and Nigel make a capable and distinctive vocal group on many of Elton's recordings during this period. You can hear them, for example, on Pinky, Grimsby, and I've Seen the Saucers elsewhere on Caribou. One listen to Grimsby makes it clear that the band could have handled the backing vocals on Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me if he had wanted to use them. Obviously, Elton wanted something special for this track. Reportedly, he initially assembled an all-star group consisting of Bruce Johnston, Brian Wilson, Cat Stevens, Dusty Springfield, Danny Hutton of Three Dog Night, and Jerry Beckley of America, with Bruce in charge of the arrangements. Of that group, Bruce was quoted as saying, "Everybody was afraid of one another, and I really couldn't get a performance out of anyone." I'd certainly love to hear the outtakes from that session. As it was, Bruce reconvened just using himself, Billy Hinchy, Tony Tennille, and Carl, and got the great performance that we hear on the record. And keep in mind that at the time, Tony Tennille and the Captain, Daryl Dragon, who assisted Bruce in arranging the vocals, were pretty much unknown. If they were known at all, it was probably as former members of the Beach Boys backing band. It wouldn't be until about a year later, in the summer of 1975, that their breakthrough hit Love Will Keep Us Together launched them to stardom of their own. David Gilmour and Roger Waters of Pink Floyd were sufficiently impressed with Bruce's arrangement that they asked him to recreate it 5 years later for several tracks on their album The Wall. Some sources have it that Pink Floyd first approached the Beach Boys to do the backing vocals. For the project, Bruce put together a group consisting of himself, Tony Tennille, plus Joe Chimay, Stan Farber, Jim Haas, and John Joyce, who contributed backing vocals to In the Flesh, with a question mark, The Show Must Go On, In the Flesh, without a question mark, and Waiting for the Worms. In Tony Tennille's memoir, she recalls the backing group for Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me as being herself, Bruce, Carl, and studio singer John Joyce. John is seen here at the far left in both photos on much later Roger Waters tours of The Wall, where he provided backing vocals. I suspect Tony Tennille is misremembering John Joyce's participation in Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me and forgetting Billy Hinchy. In addition to working with John Joyce and Bruce on The Wall, she also worked with them, among others, providing backing vocals on Chameleon and Crazy Water on Elton John's 1976 album Blue Moves, and on the track Dear God on the 1980 album 21 at 33, so the confusion is kind of understandable. Incidentally, as mentioned in an earlier episode, Elton John had composed the song Chameleon specifically for the Beach Boys, who passed on it. For those counting missed Beach Boy opportunities, there are two more: passing on Chameleon, and if they were in fact asked to participate, missing out on Pink Floyd's The Wall. Released as the lead-off single A-side for the Caribou album on June 10, 1974, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me peaked at number 2 for 2 weeks beginning July 27th, behind Annie's Song by John Denver. And I have no doubt that Elton John was very aware of the song that kept him from US number 1 that summer. I'm sure everybody knows the song. One of the things that really strikes me about it is how quietly it starts out. I'm not sure if it's intentional, but it always had the effect for me of making me turn it up so that as the song built, By the end, it was blasting out of the speakers. I can imagine Elton John's initial frustration with it. Bernie Taupin's lyrics don't sit quite as comfortably with Elton John's melody as with a lot of their other songs. With lines sung like, "I can't find, oh, the right romantic line," and "don't discard me just because you think I mean you harm." I'll bet it was an ordeal to sing the first few times through, though probably not as much of an ordeal as listening to me try to sing it just now. Still, it works. It's got a beautiful melody. I love the way it builds, driven in large part by those incredible backing vocals. It's a great record. Next up from Carl, we have a track from Martin and Finley's Dazzlem with Footwork album, which was released right around the same time as Caribou on June 19th, 1974. Martin and Finley were Tony Martin Jr. and Larry Guy Finley Jr. We already talked a little bit about Tony Martin Jr. back in episode 148, Carl and the Passion So Tough Part 1, because he played pedal steel guitar on Marcella. He's also credited simply as Tony Martin on the lyric insert to the Holland album. More about that when we discuss the Holland album in depth in a few weeks. He also appeared along with Carl as a backing vocalist on Kathy Dalton's 1973 album Amazing, which we discussed last time. He was the son of entertainers Tony Martin and Sid Charisse. His father, Tony Martin, had an impressive string of 36 top 40 hits from 1938 through 1956. During the same period, he appeared in many films, including co-starring with the Marx Brothers in The Big Store in 1941, and with Bob Hope in Here Come the Girls in 1953. He married actress-dancer Sid Charisse in 1948. She had a great career as well, including co-starring with Fred Astaire in The Bandwagon in 1953, and with Gene Kelly in Brigadoon in 1954. She and husband Tony Martin often appeared on stage together, and both of them were active in the early days of television. After the mid-50s, they continued working, making many guest appearances on television until the mid-80s, and occasional appearances after that. Sid Charisse passed away in 2008. Tony Martin passed away in 2012. Gary Finley didn't have quite that star-studded pedigree, but his father, Larry Finley, was an early pioneer in late-night television, as well as behind the scenes in the audio and videotape industries. With those backgrounds, it certainly sounds like they'd have been moving in the same social circles as other musical kids of showbiz celebrities and their friends, such as Bruce and Terry and Desi, Dino, and Billy. It's a social circle Carl became part of after the Beach Boys' success. Martin and Finley began recording as a duo in 1972, doing a couple of obscure singles for Motown's sub-label Mo West before being moved to the main Motown label. Weirdly, I noticed their 1972 single, Long Life and Success to the Farmer, is noted around the 4 o'clock position as being in album Dazzlem with Footwork. Dazzlem with Footwork wasn't released until 1974, and when it was, that track wasn't on it. It leads me to believe that this album had a long and complicated gestation process. They played pleasant, poppy, optimistic, soft rock, roughly in the vein of America and Poco, with fewer country touches and some Harry Nilsson added in. One of them had a soulful rock and roll voice with plenty of range that sounded very roughly like an American Paul McCartney. The other often sounds like a cross between Neil Diamond and David Clayton Thomas. I'd only be guessing at which is which. The album gives general credit showing backing vocals by Carl Wilson, Bruce Johnston, Billy Hinchy, and Four Seasons member Bob Gaudio. Bob Gaudio produced and arranged the album as he did with all the Martin and Finley recordings. The 1982 book Surf's Up credits the backing singers specifically on the lead track and the album's single, Whitebird. Having listened to the album a few times, I don't hear any other tracks that sound like it might feature Carl, Bruce, Billy, or Bob Gaudio, so I think that's probably correct. Whitebird is a pleasant enough tune. It's a little tougher than the rest, which might be the reason it was chosen as the single. With Bob Gaudio at the helm, it's beautifully produced, like everything on the album, though there's a banjo on this track that to me seems completely superfluous. Carl can be heard among the many oohs and ahs behind the lead vocals. A later section with the vocal chorus echoing the hook, When the White Bird Flew the Last Time, actually sounds a bit like the backing vocals on a Partridge Family album. I can't discern any of the individual voices in that section, and actually if not for the liner notes, I would have assumed it was mostly female voices in there. Reportedly, and not surprisingly, some of the album's failure to connect was chalked up to Motown's inexperience at promoting soft rock acts. I imagine that played a part, but truthfully, as I've said before, as pleasant as this album is, there was a lot of stuff like this around in the day, and I think it would have had trouble cutting through even with fantastic promotion. Finley and Martin seem to have gone their separate ways after this album. Both carried on with solo careers for a while, did session work and songwriting. Tony Martin Jr. passed away in 2011. Today, Guy Finley is a self-help and inspirational writer and teacher. His online community can be found at guyfinley.org. Last time we discussed Kathy Dalton's 1973 album, Amazing. Carl provided backing vocals on 5 tracks on the album. He also provided backing vocals on the A-side of her single, Boogie Bands and One Night Stands, released July 29, 1974. The B-side, Pour Your Wine All Over Me, is a track from the Amazing album that Carl does not appear on. The single and the other tracks from the Amazing album were repackaged as the Boogie Bands and One Night Stands album, released on October 21st of 1974. Like other Kathy Dalton tracks, this one is written by Greg Dempsey. It starts as a solo country gospel type number featuring a lonely saxophone. It begins promisingly, but the chorus it builds to seems a little disjointed and underwhelming. Kathy Dalton's voice moves somewhere between Joan Baez and Bonnie Bramlett on this track with a little more country inflection. There's some high doo-wop style vocal at a couple of points in the record, noticeably toward the ending. The lead on that doesn't sound like Carl, and it's far too loose and undisciplined to be him. He's probably in the background somewhere in the oohs and ahs, but I can't distinctly hear him at any point. I'm sure loose and funky is what they were going for on this, but when I hear that kind of sloppy doo-wop vocal, it makes me wonder if Carl was tempted to suggest a better arrangement. That brings us to the end of 1974. Of course, there's still much more to come, more than 2 decades worth. But we'll take a break for now. I really want to get to 1973 and the Holland album. We'll return with more of Carl Wilson guest appearances later on. I hope you enjoyed this. I look forward to your comments. If you can think of anything pre-1975 that I missed where Carl made a guest appearance, please let me know about that. Have a great week. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. And we will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.